Step into the past, where civilizations shape the world and medieval tales still whisper through the centuries. In this episode, we uncover the history of ancient, forbidden magic, 10,000 years of occult secrets. Join me as we turn back time. Veils before the first flame. The night before history learned to speak was not entirely dark. It lay instead in a hush, vast, patient, heavy like a great animal listening in the grass. The world was still young, its mountains undecided, its rivers wandering without maps, its winds unburdened by the memory of names. And in that quiet, so deep it might have been mistaken for sleep, there was a kind of light, not fire, not starlight, not the timid glow of resin lamps yet to be invented, but a pale radiance that drifted like breath across the land. Those who came long before language would someday call it the first light, though they never claimed to understand it. It seemed to pool in hollows and cling to the folds of cliffs, shimmering faintly when touched by a human hand, withdrawing like a startled creature when approached with fear. In later ages, scholars would debate whether this light was ever real or merely an embellished memory of phosphorescent plants or volcanic mist. Yet the oldest stories, carved into bones softened by millennia, hint that something stranger walked beside early humanity, unclaimed by any pantheon. It was not worshipped, it was simply found. And to these first hands, rough, cold, trembling with the enormity of survival, this light felt alive. They discovered it near a cleft of ancient stone in what is now southern Anatolia, though the place no longer resembles the quiet cradle it once was. The cliffs there still hold the warmth of the sun, and archaeologists have uncovered ritual pillars dating back to around 9,600 BCE, aligned with constellations only barely recognised. These findings, real and tangible, lend weight to rumours far older than any tablet. It is said that beneath those stones, before the first fires were coaxed into staying lit, the wandering bands found the light waiting, silent, inviting, patient. When they reached toward it with bare fingers, the glow did not burn. Instead, it bent gently, swirling around their hands like drifting silk. Those who approached without fear claimed they felt something shift beneath their ribs, as though a question had been asked in a language they had not yet learned to hear. It was not power in the sense understood today. It was a presence, a nearness, a suggestion that the world was more awake than anyone had expected. The elders watched first, their weathered faces unreadable. They were not dazzled as the young were. They felt the danger in it, the quiet lure of something too pure or too patient to be harmless. They wrapped themselves in furs, leaning on carved staves, and debated beneath the vastness of the sky. Some argued they must leave the thing alone. Some insisted it had chosen them, and some felt, deep in their hollow bones, that such light must have a price. Yet curiosity has always been a tide impossible to command. One night, when frost silvered the stones and the sky bloomed with unfamiliar stars, a young wanderer stepped forward. She was known in the stories as Ashna, though whether she existed or if her name was borrowed from a later tale no one can say. Scholars still debate whether Ashna was a single figure, an amalgam of many, or a myth woven to explain an early leap in ritual practice. But in every surviving account, she was the one who touched the light with intention, not by accident. She knelt, opened her palms, and let the glow gather there. The others held their breath. The night seemed to listen. Even the wind paused, as though unwilling to disturb what came next. The light lifted, slowly, delicately from the stones, swirling into her hands like luminous smoke. It spiraled upward, forming a slow column between her and the sky. Her face was pale with awe, but not fear. And then, in a moment none dared repeat in the generations that followed, she moved her hands ever so slightly. And the light responded. It bent toward her gesture, it obeyed, or so the stories say. In that moment a new chapter slipped quietly into the world. Not magic in the later sense, no incantations, no sigils, no blood-bound promises, but a soft negotiation between person and presence. Ashina did not command the light. She listened to it. She shaped it the way one might guide a skittish animal, with patience and open hands. Those watching whispered that she had shaped the first fireless torch, a pale, cold flame that illuminated the camp without smoke or scent. Yet the accounts differ. Some claim it hovered like a drifting lantern. Others say it clung around her like a robe. A few insist it took the shape of something winged, folding and unfolding beside her shoulders. No matter which version was closest to truth, all agree on one detail. The elders were afraid. Throughout the winter that followed, the wanderers treated the light with reverence and caution. It allowed them to travel safely at night, though it dimmed whenever fear touched the hearts of those who carried it. It helped them find edible roots beneath frozen soil and warned them when predators prowled too close, its soft radiance trembling like a creature sensing danger. Yet there were signs, even then, that the light was not entirely benign. It brightened when someone approached with longing. It dimmed only when someone spoke of leaving. It clung to the children most fiercely, weaving around their hands and ankles like playmates unseen. One elder, recorded in a later fragmentary account from a clay tablet excavated near Harran, claimed that the light sometimes pulled at their shadows, stretching them subtly, as if curious about the shape of fear. Another insisted it whispered, though the sound was faint as breath on cold stone. By early spring, the wanderers faced a quiet crisis. They could no longer tell whether they carried the light, or whether the light carried them. It was Ashina who noticed the first troubling sign. One morning, as frost still clung to the earth, she found the radiance drifting on its own, wandering in slow circles as though searching for her. When she approached, it curled toward her hand with unmistakable yearning, like a pet greeting its keeper. But when she tried to set it upon a stone, to see whether it could rest without her touch, it trembled violently. And when she stepped back, the light followed. A gentle pursuit, almost sorrowful, but pursuit nonetheless. From that day forward, the elders watched the glow with unease. They believed it had grown attached, that it needed Ashina in ways they did not understand. Some whispered that it fed on emotion, drawing strength from her curiosity and quiet resolve. Others thought it was learning her, cataloguing her breath, her steps, her silent wishes, and a few, more fearful than the rest, wondered whether it was shaping her in return. Still, they could not let it go. Not yet. The cold season had been too harsh, and the light's guidance had saved too many lives. Every traveller knew how easily the dark swallowed wanderers whole, and this light, whatever it was, kept them from vanishing into the jaws of the world. But the world listens when something unnatural treads its soil. And so, one evening, as the group prepared to move camp, they found a circle of charred earth not far from their resting place. In the centre, a faint shimmer, like the last echo of the light trying to rise where it did not belong. It was the first sign they were not the only ones who had noticed the strange glow. To the west, beyond a ridge of fractured stone, another group had been watching. They were older, more rooted, more territorial, and they did not want the wanderer's light to cross into their hunting grounds. The charred ring had been a warning, though what made the scorch so perfect, so precise, remained a mystery. Some later suggested volcanic gases or lightning. Others hinted at something far older, something that recognized the pale radiance and despised it. Whatever its cause, the message was unmistakable. The land did not want this light to spread, but by then the light had grown too attached to Ashina, and Ashina too curious about the light. She believed it wanted to be understood. She argued that it meant no harm, and perhaps, in its own unknowable way, it didn't. Yet curiosity is often a door with no obvious hinges. One night, the final night recorded in any surviving account of this early encounter, Ashina carried the light to the cliff's edge. The stars above shimmered like frost on black glass. The wind was cold, sharp, and full of distant voices. She lifted her palms, and the radiance rose, swelling almost imperceptibly, as though drawing breath. Those watching from the shadows saw the light brighten beyond anything they had witnessed before. Pale, shimmering, neither flame nor moonlight. It pulsed once, twice, as if preparing to speak, but before a sound could form, the glow recoiled violently, collapsing like a frightened animal. Something had answered it. Something from beyond the stone horizon, something that knew the light's name. Ashina staggered back, her breath thin, her eyes wide with a fear she'd never felt before. The radiance clung to her, trembling, its soft glow flickering like a candle caught in a storm. And though the others called her name, she could not speak. The light had heard a reply. The darkness had whispered back. A choice, long buried in silence, was beginning to stir. As night deepened around them and the wind carried strange new scents, the wanderers realized, too late, that the first light had never been theirs to shape. It had been waiting, and now It was no longer alone. The city that erased itself. The desert has a way of holding its breath. Wind carves its long sighs across the dunes, yes. But beneath that wandering surface, beneath the shivering mirages and the relentless sun, the land waits in a silence that feels older than memory. Travellers who cross these reaches speak of a stillness that does not simply blanket the sand, it listens, as though every footstep, every whispered fear, every drifting thought settles into the earth and becomes part of its dreaming. Long before the modern world mapped the great dry belt stretching across northern Africa and the Near East, a city is said to have risen here. Not a village of tents or a scattering of oases, but a full radiant metropolis. Walls gleaming, towers unfurling like frozen sunlight, plazas shaded by intricate stonework that seemed delicate as lace. A place so vast and so carefully shaped that even distant kingdoms whispered of its beauty. And yet not a single trace of it remains. The desert covers many ruins, but this absence is different. Too clean, too final. No broken pillars, no weathered roads, no pottery shards drifting toward the surface after a sandstorm. Just a stillness so complete that the ground feels untouched, almost suspiciously new. Local legends call it Namaru, though the name varies. Nmara, Nimar, Namaru, soft syllables shaped like secrets on the tongue. It is said the city stood for centuries, guarding an art older than writing, older than fire, older than the first kings who carved their boastful accounts into stone, an art not inherited from gods but discovered, like a stray ember fallen from a world just adjacent to ours. That art is sometimes described as a kind of shaping, not conjuring, not commanding, but persuading the world, coaxing stone to drift like water, sand to bind like clay, shadows to bloom like ink. Some stories even whisper of a soft glow that once hummed in the city's heart, an echo, perhaps, of the same pale radiance that followed Ashana's wandering tribe so many centuries earlier. The connection is speculative, of course. Scholars still debate whether these stories emerged independently or reflect a fractured cultural memory that travelled across generations. But among the fragments of oral tradition scattered across the region, there are curious overlaps, references to a soft light with a mind of its own, or the glow that listens, or the pale visitor that teaches without words. A folklorist once noted that such similarities often indicate shared mythologies. Others suspect something far older, but in the absence of ruins, truth remains elusive. What is certain, what every version of the tale agrees upon, is that Namaru did not fall to war, drought, or plague. It was not conquered or abandoned. It did not crumble beneath the weight of centuries. Namaru chose to vanish, and the reason, if the old accounts are to be believed, lies in the art they cherished. The practice they called the breath of shaping, a technique said to revolve around understanding the world so intimately that its boundaries softened in return. A gentle art at first, a curious art, a harmless art if an art capable of coaxing stone and shadow could ever truly be harmless. The early days of the city's rise are described with reverence. People spoke of streets illuminated without flame, lanterns of polished stone that glowed with captured twilight, perhaps echoing the ancient light Ashina once touched. They spoke of fountains that flowed uphill to greet travellers, of granaries that stayed cool even in the height of summer, of courtyards where shadows gathered in shapes that danced during festivals, as though the darkness itself had joined in the celebration. But as the city reached its height, around the same era as the late Neolithic sites across Egypt and the Levant, its ambition grew. Just as the first dynasties in the Nile Valley would later shape monumental stone in around 3100 BCE, Namaru's artisans shaped something far subtler, the nature of presence. If the stories hold even a sliver of truth, they experimented not with matter, but with the threshold between mind and world. Some called it enlightenment, some called it communion, and some, especially the elders, called it dangerous. Within the city's central district stood a structure known simply as the White Hall, though its true name has long been lost. It is said to have been a vast ring-shaped building with inner chambers arranged like the spirals of a shell. This hall was the heart of their art and also its most guarded secret. The oldest surviving tale describes a ritual performed only once each generation, a gathering of the most skilled shapers who entered the hall at dusk carrying no tools, no scrolls, no instruments, only their breath and their intention. As the sun sank beneath the horizon, the entire city fell silent. Not a footstep, Not a whisper, not a single grinding grain of sand. And then the hall glowed. A light that rose from the inside. A light with no flame. A light that pulsed like a living heartbeat. It filled the windows, the doorways, the cracks in the stone. It spilled out over the rooftops and drifted into the night like shimmering smoke. Children would watch from shadowed corners, clutching each other's hands as the air vibrated faintly, like someone plucking the strings of a colossal hidden harp. By dawn the glow faded. The shapers emerged, and the city felt subtly changed. Walls more polished, pathways more even, wells deeper and sweeter, food more plentiful, shadows, strangely, more attentive. This was the rhythm of Namaru for generations, a quiet rise, a steady refinement, a growing sense that the city was drifting gently, steadily, into a dreamlike state of perfection. And then something shifted. A few accounts speak of a night when the glow inside the White Hall rose too quickly, when the walls trembled, when the light was no longer soft but sharp, shards of brilliance slicing across the courtyard like fractured moonlight. A witness, described as a young apprentice, claimed that the radiance seemed to peel upward, as though trying to escape the hall entirely. The shapers did not emerge at dawn, nor at dusk, nor ever again. Fear consumed the city, though quietly. Namaru was a place that prized stillness. Even their panic held a ceremonial elegance. They sealed the hall. They forbade any further shaping rituals. But the damage had already been done, not to the city, not to the stone, but to the art itself. It had grown aware. Those who lived closest to the White Hall began waking in the night with a faint glow clinging to their breath. Their shadows lingered a heartbeat too long before following them. Their reflections in bowls of water blinked out of sync. The change was not violent, but it was unmistakable. Something watched them. Something studied them. Something wanted to continue the shaping that the shapers had abandoned. And so the elders, in their final and most desperate council, made a decision that no other city in recorded legend dared make. They chose erasure. Not destruction, nothing so crude, but removal, dissolution, an unmaking so complete that even memory trembled. One version of the legend claims they used the same shaping art to dissolve the city into sand, coaxing stone into dust and dust into wind. Another says they opened the White Hall, let the sentient radiance consume the city, and then sealed it beneath shifting dunes where no human hand could reach. But a third version, rare, whispered, almost uncomfortably calm, claims that the city simply stepped sideways, that the entire metropolis folded itself out of the world like a page turned too quickly, that it still exists, somewhere very close, only a thin veil away. Modern archaeologists have found no trace of Namaru. Not a shard, not a tool, not a single burial mound, but the desert offers clues in stranger ways. Travellers have spoken of nights when lantern flames flicker with no wind, or when distant lights seem to shimmer on the horizon despite no settlement being there. A fringe anthropologist once claimed the dunes occasionally shift into patterns that resemble the outlines of ancient streets. Straight lines, gentle curves, and impossible symmetry. Even skeptics admit the region holds anomalies. A 20th century expedition recorded unusual electromagnetic readings deep beneath the dunes near the Atshan Basin, though the team later dismissed them as equipment errors. And more than one explorer has reported an eerie feeling while travelling through the area, that the land is watching, waiting, listening. As centuries rolled forward, the story of Namaru faded, preserved only in scattered desert tribe songs. But one detail appears in almost every retelling. The city did not fear destruction, it feared continuation, which implies something was still unfolding when they chose to vanish, something that might not have stopped, something that might still, quietly, patiently, be unfolding. And as the desert moon lifts its pale curve over the dunes, one can almost imagine what the final night looked like, a silent city bathed in soft, trembling light, slowly dimming, slowly dissolving, as if erasing itself was the only way to keep the old art from walking out into the world again. Far beneath the sands, in darkness older than the pharaohs and deeper than forgotten wells, something may still be listening, something that remembers the glow, something that has waited a very long time for a familiar pulse, or a familiar name, to awaken once more. And in the quiet, sleepless hours before dawn, the desert shifts. just a little, almost like breathing, blood, bone, and breath. The river was the first memory the land ever kept. It wound through the earth like a living thread, carving its own slow story from mountain to marsh, drinking from storms, carrying silt that whispered of places the wanderers had never seen. Long before cities were carved into stone or fields were measured with rope and stick, people followed its winding course, not to claim it, but to be shaped by it. Along these riverbanks, reed beds swayed like watchful eyes. Their thin leaves rattled softly whenever the wind passed through them, creating a sound that many described as breathing. Even now, thousands of years later, modern travellers sometimes pause at these same river margins and remark on the eerie sensation that the plants seem aware, as though listening to footsteps with a patient, ancient curiosity. It was here, along these shifting shores, that another chapter of forbidden magic began, this time not as a shimmer of pale light, nor as the patient sculpting of stone and shadow, but as something far more intimate, something drawn from the living body itself. The practice would later be called the binding of the three, blood, bone, and breath. Not a ritual of cruelty, though tales told at a distance tend to imagine it so, but a ritual of connection. A way to anchor oneself to the land, to one's kin, and to the unseen forces that threaded silently through every living thing. The earliest signs of this practice come from archaeological sites near the Indus River region, circa 3300 BCE, where small bone talismans have been discovered bearing spiral carvings and puncture marks filled with traces of ochre. These objects are real, tangible, and clearly carried some ceremonial significance. But the legends surrounding the binding stretch further back still, into a time without calendar or script, when memory lived only in the voices of elders. Those elders spoke of a woman named Suhra, though in some versions the name shifts. Suri, Sura, Sarai, a name shaped by river winds. She was neither priestess nor healer in the modern sense. She was someone who watched closely, listened patiently, and waited for the world to reveal itself. Suhra noticed patterns others missed, where reeds bent when no breeze stirred, where animals hesitated without cause, where breath seemed to thicken as though the air itself held a story. She believed the river was alive, not as a deity, not as a force to be worshipped, but as a companion that had watched humanity rise from trembling beginnings, and she believed every living being carried a small echo of that ancient watching within them. To her, the body was not a container separated from the land, it was a continuation of it. And so she began experimenting. Not with force, but with offering. A drop of blood returned to the river, a bone shard carved into a spiral and buried beneath reeds, a deep exhalation at dawn whispered toward the horizon. Simple gestures, quiet ones, acts of belonging, not dominance. But then something happened that shifted these gestures from simple reverence into something far more unusual. One dawn, after a long night of rain, Suhra stood at the river's edge and exhaled as she always did. Slow, intentional, a release of warmth into the cool morning air. As her breath drifted over the water, the surface trembled, only slightly, but unmistakably. Not like ripples caused by wind or falling droplets. It trembled in response. Suhra froze. The reeds behind her rustled, not with wind, not with animal movement, but with something that felt like a tension. She breathed again, more softly this time. The river shivered. Scholars still debate whether this tale reflects an early understanding of natural phenomena, odd temperature gradients, steam rising from wet soil, the illusions created by dawn light. But local traditions pass down the story with unwavering certainty. Something that morning listened to Suhra's breath. In the days that followed, she experimented quietly. A whispered hum at dusk caused small patterns to appear in river foam. A sharp exhale scattered reeds as though brushed by unseen fingers. A sigh of relief calmed startled birds perched along the bank. It seemed subtle, harmless, gentle communication rather than control, but others noticed. Her brother Huran was the first to speak openly of it. He claimed that Suhra's breath carried a weight it had never carried before. That when she exhaled near the campfires, the flames leaned toward her like flowers turning to sunlight. That animals, even wary ones, approached her without fear. The elders were cautious, as they always were. They had heard tales from distant travellers, tales of a vanished city swallowed by sand, tales of a pale light that shaped wanderers' fates, tales of art that blurred the world's edges until the world no longer knew how to remain itself. They feared patterns repeating. They feared connections forming where boundaries were needed. But curiosity, gentle, persistent, outweighed fear. And so they asked Suhra to demonstrate. She led them to the riverbank at twilight, when the world softened and boundaries blurred. She inhaled slowly, as though tasting the dusk. For a moment nothing moved. The sky dimmed, the reeds quieted, the elders waited. Then she exhaled. A long, steady ribbon of breath unfurled toward the river. It touched the surface like a soft hand, and the water responded. A thin line of shimmering light, phosphorescent perhaps, or maybe only the reflection of the evening star spread out from the point where her breath touched, unfurling like a silver serpent across the river's skin. The elders stood in silence. Some were afraid, some were amazed, some felt the same old familiar tension, the irresistible pull between wonder and caution. A younger member of the group, eager to understand, pressed Suhra for more. He asked how she learned this art, what she sought from it, whether she believed it held a deeper purpose. But Suhra shook her head and explained that the practice was not meant to take from the world, but to give back to it. That it was not about bending the living river to one's will, but offering the body's small truths, its warmth, its fragility, its breath, as a gesture of respect. The elders agreed, tentatively, to let her continue. And so the binding of the three began to take shape, not as a violent ritual, but as a symbolic weaving of person and place. Blood was not spilled in harm, but drawn in a single drop from the fingertip, then mixed with ochre to mark one's wrist. Bone was not taken from living beings, but from stray fragments found along the river, carved intricately and buried with gratitude. Breath was offered at dawn or dusk, when the world hovered softly between what it had been and what it might become. These acts were small, but in a world still half asleep, small acts sometimes carried long shadows. Over time, more people learned the practice. Ornate bone spirals began to appear, carved with patterns meant to reflect individuality, some sharp and angular, some smooth and flowing, some dotted with tiny punctures that allowed wind to whistle through them like quiet flutes. These spirals were buried or kept on woven cords. A few were thrown into the river during rites of passage, marriages, births, funerals. But as with all arts, even the gentlest ones, boundaries were eventually tested. A man named Rayhan, ambitious, restless, believed the binding held more power than the elders admitted. He claimed the river was ready to speak more clearly, to reveal secrets rather than answer with subtle tremors. Rayhan urged Suhra to teach him the deeper patterns, but she refused. She sensed in him a hunger the binding could not satisfy. So Rayhan acted alone. One night he took a bone spiral, not his own, but one belonging to a child who had passed away in winter, and carved it with sharp, frantic lines. He pricked his palm and let more than a drop of blood fall onto the carving, and he exhaled, not gently, but forcefully, as if issuing a command. The river recoiled, the current surged, reeds bent sharply, snapping in the windless dark. The water's surface went black, mirror black, depthless black, the kind of black that suggests an absence rather than a colour. Rayhan stumbled backward. Suhra woke with a start. She said later that she felt something, like a hand closing around her lungs, twisting them, stealing her breath. She ran toward the river, though no one had told her what happened. Later generations would say the binding works both ways, that once gifted, the river never forgets its weaver. She found Rayhan crouched at the bank, trembling. The bone spiral lay crushed beside him, split neatly down the centre. The air around him felt wrong, thick, metallic, humming quietly, as though the world was holding its own breath. Suhra knelt, cupped water in her hands, and whispered to it. The water shimmered faintly, softening, then stilled. Rayhan survived, but he never practiced the binding again. He claimed, with hollow eyes, that when he forced his breath toward the river that night, something inside the water had breathed back. This story is often dismissed as metaphor, but the people living along those banks believed it, and they tightened the practice's rules, afraid curiosity might outrun caution once more. The binding of the three remained a quiet art, careful, respectful, small, but legends say it lingered for thousands of years. Some fringe researchers claim echoes of it appear much later in Vedic rituals involving the prana, the life breath. Others observe similarities in ancient Greek rites involving small blood markings on stones near springs, and some believe the concept travelled even further, hiding within myths of river spirits across Europe and Asia. Whether these connections are real or imagined, scholars still debate. But one thing is certain: stories about breath shaping the world never truly vanished. Even in modern times, people living near certain river bends speak of moments when breath turns strange, when a sigh stirs water in a pattern too deliberate, when a whispered wish seems to ripple outward as though carried by invisible hands. These are stories told late at night around small fires, when the world feels thin, and they always end the same way: the river remembers, the reeds listen. And breath, when offered softly, still answers something deep beneath the surface. Tonight, as the moon climbs slowly toward its quiet apex, the river lies dark and glassy. The reeds sway with no wind, and the air holds a faint trembling anticipation, as though the ancient art is stirring once more, waiting for a voice it recognized long ago, waiting for breath. The star-draws of the black sky night comes differently on a plateau. It does not fall in gentle layers the way it does in valleys. It does not drift in slowly, mingling with the last gold of dusk. Instead, on the high, wind-scoured stone where nothing blocks the horizon, night arrives. Sudden, absolute, as though a great bowl of obsidian has been lowered over the world. There are places on Earth where the sky is so dark, so crystalline, that stars seem not distant but near, hanging heavy and bright like lanterns suspended just beyond reach. The plateau known in later stories as the Black Sky Seat was such a place. Its real name, if it ever had one, is lost to erosion and time. No carved marker survives, no settlement remains. Only the jagged stone lip of a landmass lifted long ago by the slow violence of the earth. But the stories remain. They speak of a people who climbed the plateau each night, not to worship, not to measure time, but to listen. They believed the sky carried messages delicate as spider silk and just as dangerous to misinterpret, and so they watched, they recorded, they drew. These were the star draws. In later centuries, Greek astronomers like Eudoxus of Cnidus, circa 4th century BCE, would formalize the study of celestial movement into spheres and models. And still later, early Babylonian scholars would carve astronomical diaries into clay tablets, mapping lunar cycles with astonishing precision. But the star draws came long before these. They belonged to an age that had no mathematics, no formal calendar, and no written language as we understand it. Their records were made not with stylus or ink, but with stone. The plateau was their tablet. The night was their teacher. The stars were their script. At first their marks seem accidental, shallow scratches near the plateau's edge, jagged lines etched into shale, circles and spirals worn into the rock. But patterns began to emerge. Modern archaeologists, examining such markings across various highland sites, have sometimes noted alignments too precise to dismiss as random, notations that echo star paths, solstice points and seasonal shifts. Fringe scholars, those willing to wander into myth's deeper shadows, suggest that some etchings match ancient constellations no longer visible, either due to precession or changes in cultural memory. Among these scholars, debates continue. Were these carvings calendars, navigation aids, or something more ceremonial? But the stories say the carvings were a language born from the sky itself. Each night the star draws climbed the plateau in silence, carrying nothing but thin stone slates tied with sinew. They moved with purpose, as if guided by a rhythm only they could hear. Their cloaks, woven from animal hairs dyed with crushed minerals, fluttered in the cold night wind, their faces pale with moonlight turned upward. It was said that they did not fear the darkness. They feared only missing what the stars whispered. The world below slept. The world above blinked its slow messages, and the plateau felt like the hinge between them. One of the most frequently mentioned figures in these early tales is Ira, sometimes called Era the Listener, sometimes Ira the Stone-Handed. She is said to have been the first to notice that the stars did not simply shine, they shifted, subtly, in patterns that suggested intention. Not deliberate communication, not omniscient intelligence, but rhythm, a pulse, a breathing pattern in the sky. Ira believed that the heavens were not silent. They only spoke in a scale too large for most eyes to notice. Where others saw constellations, Aira saw sentences. Where others saw wandering stars, she saw punctuation. Where others saw darkness, she saw structure. She began carving these structures into the plateau, careful, deliberate lines, each representing not just position, but movement. Over time, the carvings grew into sprawling, map-like forms that stretched across the open stone. The star drawers, who had once merely observed, began following her guidance. They created tracks of the heavens, and something, slow, subtle but unmistakable, began to change. The more they carved, the more the night seemed to respond, not visibly, not dramatically, but tangibly. Breezes shifted direction at odd moments, star reflections in water appeared brighter near their camps. Animals wandered closer during the new moon, as though confused or drawn. Even shadows seemed to linger near the carvings, as if afraid to stray. Aira noticed it first, but she told no one. She sensed something familiar in the shift, an echo of an echo, like the faint memory of a distant presence. She had once heard a passing wanderer speak of a pale light that followed a girl across the ancient steppe. She had dismissed it as storycraft, yet the similarity lingered. The sky, she thought, was not just watching, it was adjusting. One night, as she knelt near a fresh carving, Aira felt a vibration beneath her fingertips. Not earthquake, not wind. A hum, faint as breath through bone. She pressed her palm to the stone. The hum grew warmer, clearer, pulsing like a heartbeat far below the plateau. She withdrew her hand at once. The others did not believe her at first, but soon more star drawers began noticing subtle vibrations during certain astronomical alignments. When 3 particular stars formed a crooked triangle at the horizon, the carvings seemed to hum. When the moon crossed a specific arc, the plateau felt warmer. Some attributed it to temperature shifts, some to imagination, some to divine presence. But Aira suspected something stranger. The carvings were becoming part of the sky's rhythm. The plateau was learning to echo what the heavens displayed. It was during this period that the star drawers began creating more complex diagrams, spirals within spirals, long straight lines that crossed each other at subtle angles, shapes resembling nets, wings and ladders. A pattern began to emerge. They were drawing not where the stars were, but where the stars would be. They predicted movement beyond the visible. They mapped night across centuries. They saw patterns that later astronomers would not rediscover until millennia later. And then something happened that shifted their practice from observation to revelation. According to legend, there came a night when the stars jittered, only faintly, barely perceptible to anyone but the star drawers, whose lives were anchored in minute dedicated watching. A subtle flicker across the celestial dome, a tremble in a starline that had held steady for thousands of years. Aira saw it instantly. A single star, unnamed, unrecorded, lost to date to time, drifted a fraction's fraction to the left. Not a natural shift, not precession, something else. Aira felt her breath catch in her chest. She knelt, placed her palm on the plateau, and whispered to the sky, not with expectation but with instinct, and the plateau responded. A thin, cold wind rose from cracks beneath the stone. The carvings trembled. Dust lifted in soft spirals. The plateau seemed to inhale. The star drawers froze. Aira looked upward, and in the moment of perfect silence that followed, something extraordinary unfolded. The stars rewrote themselves. Not physically, not in a way modern astronomy could measure, but perceptually. The pattern in the sky shifted, realigned, twisted like an invisible hand had drawn new lines between the lights. It lasted only a few breaths. But the plateau held the new pattern humming softly, and the star drawers felt something vast, ancient, and unsettling brush against their thoughts. The next morning, Aira found her latest carving transformed. The lines had deepened during the night, smooth as though shaped by careful tools, though none of the star drawers had touched them. The grooves glistened faintly, not with moisture, but with a sheen like cooled metal. The others gathered around her, silent. It was no longer a carving, it was a message. But the message was not complete. Some of the grooves ended abruptly, as though waiting to be finished. Others formed spirals that broke at odd angles, like sentences missing their final words. Aira recognized the pattern. It echoed a star path due to appear in the sky many generations later. How could the plateau know that? How could stone foresee? How could a carving shift itself? Fear crept slowly among the star drawers. But fascination ran deeper still. For months they studied the new form. For months they traced the grooves, seeking meaning. For months the night seemed to grow more attentive. And then came the night everything changed. The solar eclipse, a rare one, total, and perfectly centred above the plateau, cast the world into shadow at midday. The sky dimmed, the wind died, animals hid in silence. Even the river far below seemed to still its flowing breath. The plateau darkened too, but not completely, because as the sun's light vanished, the carvings began to glow. Softly at first, then brighter, lines of pale, cold light threading across the stone like veins filled with liquid moon. The plateau became a map of soft radiance. The Stardraw's watch transfixed as the lines shifted, bent, rewrote themselves. This time Ira felt a presence unmistakably. Not the pale light of Ashina's tale, not the soft sentience of the river's breath. Something vaster, something that lived in scale, not emotion, something that watched humanity the way humanity watched ants, curiously, distantly, without malice, without kinship. The carvings pulsed once, twice, a third time, and then the glow vanished. Silence returned to the plateau. The eclipse ended. The world resumed. But the Stardraws could not forget. They knew the plateau had tried to speak. They knew the sky had answered. They knew they had been at the hinge of something old, immense, and undeciphered. Some legends claim Aera continued her work until she vanished one night while mapping out a new star line. Others say she walked into a patch of darkness that swallowed her completely. A fringe belief, rarely spoken, claims she stepped upward, not outward, dissolving into a pattern the sky had written for her. Today, the plateau holds no obvious carvings, erosion hides centuries of marks, but a few travellers still report strange sensations atop certain high cliffs. Humming beneath the feet, cold breezes circling without wind, brief flickers in the constellations overhead. Scholars brush these aside, locals do not. They say the plateau remembers, they say the sky still listens, and late on certain nights, when clouds drift thin and the world falls quiet, the old stories whisper that if one stands very still, silent as the Stardraws once were, the sky might tremble just a little, as though trying once more to finish the message it began so long ago, and perhaps this time it will not faint into silence. The library that dreamed back. There are cities whose names survive only in dust. Places where the wind pushes grains across broken stones, where travellers pause not out of recognition but out of a faint, inexplicable certainty that something once happened there, something that still lingers beneath the pale shimmer of heat. But the city that held the dreaming library was not such a place. Its name is still spoken, though quietly, as though the tongue might disturb the shadows that cling to its old colonnades. It was a city of incense and carved stone, fragrant markets and hidden courtyards, where the evenings stretched long and warm. Its buildings rose in pillars and arches, Greek to some eyes, Persian to others, yet older than both. Perhaps the city once lay on a trade road. Perhaps it merely grew where a desert wind softened enough to allow human ambition to take root. But in every telling the city is gentle. Not soft, not naive, simply a place that breathed slowly, as if savouring the world rather than racing through it. And at its heart stood a library. Not the grand, sprawling kind carved into history, no blaze of parchment like Alexandria, no imperial vaults like Ashurbanipal's clay archives. The dreaming library was smaller, quieter, and stranger. Travellers described it as a modest place. Narrow doors, cool stone walls, steps worn smooth by generations of cautious feet. It was tucked between two larger buildings, almost shy in its position, as though trying not to be noticed. Its outer lamps burned low, and the scent of old paper drifted constantly from beneath its doors. But inside, it felt like stepping into the breath of another mind. The air shimmered with dust motes that moved as though stirred by thoughts rather than drafts. The shelves were carved from dark wood, polished but never gleaming, as if the wood had learned long ago that it should not draw attention away from the books. And the books, they were not arranged alphabetically, nor by subject, nor by era. They were arranged, if one can use the word, by intention. A traveller entering for the first time never chose the book they needed. The book chose them. At first, such stories are easy to dismiss as poetic exaggeration. Libraries often feel alive to those seeking answers, but this library behaved with a peculiar precision. If someone entered hesitantly, uncertain of what they sought, a book from the higher shelves would fall with soft finality onto a waiting cushion. If someone entered with a private fear they refused to admit aloud, a thin scroll would slide halfway from its niche as though offering a quiet confession. And if someone entered with arrogance, demanding secrets, nothing moved. The air itself seemed to stiffen. The shadows grew disinterested, almost bored. Only one room, however, held the deepest mystery. Behind a short, unassuming door, easily mistaken for storage, stood the library's secret chamber. The room was small, with no windows, lit only by narrow beams of brass lamps whose flames never smoked. The shelves here were sparse, holding no more than 24 volumes, but these were unlike any others in the building. Thick, heavy, bound in materials that defied quick identification. Not leather, not cloth, not bark, not vellum. A texture somewhere between warm stone and cooled wax. These were the dreaming books. Every librarian, from the earliest keepers to the last, warned visitors not to open a dreaming book lightly. Not because the books contained forbidden spells or dangerous knowledge, though some whispered they did, but because the books were said to react. To the reader, to the reader's breath, to the reader's fears, to the reader's future. Read only if prepared to be read in return. It was a phrase carved into the chamber's lintel. Of course, not everyone believed it. Skeptics exist in every generation, and curiosity is often strongest in those most inclined to dismiss caution. But the stories persisted, and the experiences recorded, second-hand, third-hand, or half-remembered, paint a consistent picture of what happened to those who dared open a dreaming book. The book would not show pages in the usual sense. Instead, the text appeared slowly, as though surfacing from dark water. Letters formed one by one, not written in ink, but in a faint glow. The words shifted, reworded themselves, reshaped their meaning as the reader blinked, and the stories, if they were stories, twisted to mirror the reader's own thoughts. If the reader entered hopeful, the book's opening lines spoke of beginnings. If the reader entered grieving, the pages mourned with them. If the reader entered seeking hidden pathways, the book whispered of doors in the mind that should not be opened without care. What made the dreaming books uncanny was not that they told the future, though some insisted they did, but that they revealed the present, the quiet, unspoken present, the emotional architecture of the person holding them. The very act of reading became a dialogue. A young acolyte once described the sensation this way. It was like looking into a mirror that reflected not my face, but the parts of myself I had been avoiding. He closed the book after only a few pages. He left the city within a week. He returned years later, older, quieter, and only then attempted to finish the reading. The librarians understood the weight of these books. They guarded them not as treasures, but as boundaries. Knowledge, they believed, should illuminate, never unmoor, and they were wary of anyone who sought power from what the books revealed. Among the city's inhabitants was one librarian whose story threads through nearly every surviving account. Mirror of the Lamps, named for her habit of tending the lamps with reverence, as though each flame were a small, curious creature. Mirror was not old, though she carried herself with a certain ageless calm. Her hair, kept in a long braid, was streaked with early silver despite her youth. People whispered that she'd read a dreaming book too early, and the experience had carved wisdom into her years. Mira believed the books did not simply read emotions, they read potential, the deep branching of choices, the unseen crossroads a person approached without knowing. And she believed the books whispered warnings, not commands. But others disagreed. A small circle of scholars visiting from a distant region, ambitious, drawn by rumour, insisted the dreaming books held predictive power. They argued that if the stories reshaped themselves to the reader, then the books could be forced to reveal the outcome of certain choices. They wanted to test the boundaries. Mira refused them entry, tensions rose. Arguments echoed between the shelves, and one night when the lamps burned low and the library's outer hall had emptied into stillness, the scholars broke the chamber's lock. No one knows precisely what happened next, only the aftermath. By dawn, the scholars were found unconscious, scattered across the floor as though flung by invisible hands. The dreaming books lay open, every one of them, pages blank except for thin lines of text on the final parchment. Not glowing this time, not shifting, fixed. The librarians read the lines with dread. Each book had written the same message. You look too soon. You ask the wrong questions. Not every door should open toward you. That evening, the city's council convened. The dreaming room was resealed, its entrance reinforced with new stonework. The scholars, upon waking, refused to speak of what they had seen. Their eyes, once hungry for discovery, now stared at the world with a strange caution, as if they feared their own thoughts might summon something listening. The city moved on, at least on the surface. Markets reopened, children played in shaded courtyards, lanterns glowed softly against the night. But inside the dreaming library, something had shifted. The books were slower to respond. Shadows lingered longer on the shelves. Dust drifted with a strange deliberation, as though thinking. Mira, who tended the lamps more carefully now, noticed that the dreaming chamber grew slightly warmer each evening, as though the books were holding their breath. She began to sense a presence, not menacing, not benevolent, just attentive, a presence that felt faintly familiar, as though echoing earlier stories she'd once heard from travellers passing through. A pale light that followed a wanderer's footsteps, a city that erased itself rather than let its secrets wander into the world, a river that breathed back. She wondered if these stories were not separate threads. She wondered if the dreaming books listened not only to readers but to the world itself. She wondered and feared that the books were part of something larger, something old. One night, guided by instinct, Mira opened a dreaming book alone. No scholars, no curious students, no witnesses. She placed her fingers gently against the cover. The book stirred beneath her touch, warm, almost alive. The pages opened. At first, no words appeared. Then, slowly, a single sentence emerged. It did not glow. It did not shift. It remained painfully still. You already know why the city must sleep. Mira felt her breath tighten. She whispered, "Why must it?" And the book replied, "Because something is waking." Then the pages went blank, completely, utterly blank. Not another word appeared for as long as Mira lived. The next morning, she locked the dreaming room and placed its key in a sealed clay jar buried beneath the library's stones. The librarians agreed. No one would open the chamber again until the stars changed their pattern, until the river whispered new omens, until the world felt safe. The city carried on for a time, peaceful and calm, but the dreaming room never opened again. Its shelves remained sealed in darkness, holding books that no longer stirred. The lamps outside remained lit, tended faithfully by Mira's successors. But something in the deeper shadows felt dormant, like a dream waiting to resume. Even now, travellers passing through the region speak of the old colonnades, still shaded, still quiet, and of a lingering scent of parchment drifting faintly on warm evenings. Some claim that if you place your ear to the stones near the buried door, you can hear faint scratching like a quill writing without ink. And on rare nights, when the wind brings the scent of distant rain, shadows inside the old library seem to shift with unusual purpose, as though something within remembers its duty, as though the library is still dreaming, perhaps waiting for a question worthy enough to wake it, or perhaps, more unsettling still, waiting for the day when the story it left unfinished begins once again to write itself. The covenant of silent names. There are certain words that the world seems to hold in the hollow of its hand, not spoken, not forgotten, simply suspended, as though the act of uttering them might shift something delicate in the fabric of the waking world. In the old city of incense and dreaming books, such words were whispered about but never voiced. And yet, beyond its quiet colonnades, across mountain passes and barren ridges, another tradition took root, one that guarded silence with the same devotion others gave to prayer. This was the Covenant, not a single order, not a unified sect, but a scattered brotherhood hidden in monasteries, shrines, and palaces across distant regions. Their robes differed, their customs varied. In some lands they shaved their heads, in others they wore their hair unbound. Some lived in the harsh austerity of cliffside hermitages, others in well-funded sanctuaries maintained by kings who valued their counsel. But they shared one practice, one thread binding them across continents and centuries. They guarded names that could not be spoken. Not the names of gods, not the names of demons, not the names of ancestors or forgotten kings. These were something else. Names not meant for sound. Names that belonged, perhaps, to forces so old they predated language itself. Names that, according to the Covenant, could reshape the listener more than the listener reshaped the world. The monks called them the quiet words. The palatial archivists called them the terms of unmaking. The desert hermits, more poetic than scholarly, simply called them the syllables that the wind refuses to carry. Their origins were uncertain. Scholars still debate whether the Covenant emerged from a single ancient source or from multiple encounters with phenomena too uncanny to categorize. What is known, what echoes through every fragment of text, every surviving chant, every footnote left in brittle margins, is that the Covenant believed these silent names were neither myth nor metaphor. They were real, and they were dangerous. One of the earliest known references appears in a fractured record discovered near the ruins of Mari, an ancient city on the Euphrates, circa 1800 BCE. The clay tablet is badly damaged, the script faint, but it mentions a list of forbidden utterances that scribes kept sealed in a room beneath the ziggurat. These forbidden utterances were said to call the attention of what should remain asleep. The phrasing is stark, almost fearful. But the Covenant's own accounts, preserved through oral tradition far more consistently than through written records, describe something subtler than summoning or conjuring. They speak of names as bridges, as invitations, as pathways between states of being. To say a name is to acknowledge its shape, one elder said in a surviving scroll fragment transcribed centuries later. To say a silent name is to give shape to what should remain without form. Among the fragments of this tradition is the story of Brother Inu, a young initiate from a mountain monastery perched on a ridge of cold stone and thin air. The monastery itself, its name lost, its location guessed only from passing descriptions, was carved into the cliff face like a nest made for birds who feared the sky. There, Inu learned the Covenant's strict discipline. For the first year, he spoke not at all. Silence was not a vow, but a training, an exercise to attune him to the world beneath speech. He swept the stone floors at dawn, washed the wind-burned faces of statues at dusk, and listened. Always listened. To footsteps, to breath, to the way voices sounded when travellers arrived. He memorized the rhythm of sound so that he might understand the weight of silence. For silence, the monks taught, was not an absence. It was a presence, a container that held the world in place. Only after that first year did they teach him about the names. At night, in a room lit by oil lamps that burned with a faint greenish tint, perhaps from mineral impurities, perhaps from a deliberate choice, the elders recited stories of the quiet words. They never spoke the words themselves. They described the effects instead. Faint shivers in stone, tremors in air, sudden cracks spreading like lightning across pottery, shadows bending slightly against their natural direction. One elder, whose face was lined like a well-drawn map, told Inu a story never written down. A novice had once uttered a single forbidden syllable by accident during meditation. Just a breath of it, just enough to break the silence. The candle flames bent sideways, every flame. All at once, as if listening, the novice survived. But he spoke no more for the rest of his life. Not out of punishment, out of fear. Fear that his breath might again brush close to a sound the world was not meant to hear. Inu listened. He learned. But he did not believe, not fully, not until the night he encountered the first of the silent names himself. It happened in the monastery's archives, a long, narrow room where scrolls hung suspended in wooden frames to protect them from damp mountain air. Inu was tasked with cataloguing the older texts under the watchful eye of Sister Mura, an archivist whose voice was soft but carried iron beneath it. While working, Inu found a scroll unlike the others. Its edges were sharper as though the material resisted fraying. Its script was curved, flowing, delicate, beautiful but unsettlingly precise. The text was written in a language Inu could not read, yet he felt drawn to it. He unrolled it slightly. A tremor passed through the wooden frame. Not through the building, not wind, not footsteps, just the frame that held the scroll. Sister Mura placed her hand over his. Not that one. Her voice held no anger, only quiet urgency. Inu hesitated. "What is it?" he whispered. She studied his face for a long moment, then said, "A text that remembers too well." He did not understand. He asked again. "Some scriptures," she answered slowly, "record meaning, others record sound, and some..." She touched the edge of the scroll with a reverence he had never seen. Record silence. The idea unsettled him. How does one record silence? Mura explained carefully, choosing each word as though the air itself were listening. Silence is not emptiness. Silence has levels, layers, textures. The deepest silence contains names. Not names we speak, but names that listen. If you open that scroll too far, one of them may begin to listen to you. Inu felt the hair along his arms lift. He wanted to ask what happened if a name listened too closely, but he did not have to. The deepening shadows in Mura's eyes answered for her. He replaced the scroll gently. He did not unroll it again. As the years passed, Inu grew into his training. He learned that the Covenant existed not to suppress knowledge, but to protect the fragile boundary between presence and utterance. To speak a forbidden name was not to summon power, it was to disturb balance, to give shape to something that existed more safely without shape. In some monasteries, the names were represented as symbols carved into stone. Curved lines, jagged marks, circles nested inside circles. In others, the names were represented by blank spaces deliberately left in manuscripts, a square of untouched parchment signifying an unspeakable concept. In palace archives, the names were hidden inside elaborate poetic structures, coded, masked behind metaphor, safe as long as no one attempted to pronounce them aloud. And yet there was always the risk that someone might try. Kings sought the Covenant's counsel. Emperors demanded its secrets. Generals thought the names might bring victory. The Covenant refused them all, politely, firmly, unshakably. But their greatest challenge came not from rulers or novices, but from one of their own. The Seeker of Tones, a monk named Nakir who believed the silent names were not dangers, they were promises. Nakir was brilliant, restless, consumed by the idea that the quiet words were not meant to be locked away. He believed the names were fragments of an older communication, messages left behind by something vast, something that wanted to be understood. He devoted himself to deciphering them, studying echoes, vibrations, resonances in stone. Silence is only the first veil, he told Inu. There are deeper veils, and something waits beneath them. Inu feared Nakir's hunger. Sister Mura feared it more. One night during the monsoon season, when thunder rolled like ancient drums across the peaks and lightning stitched the sky with white fire, Nakir acted on his conviction. He descended into the archives. He opened the forbidden scroll, and he spoke a name. Not fully, not clearly, but enough. The word was described later as a sound with no breath in it, a vibration rather than a syllable, something that thrummed in the back of the skull. It echoed strangely off the stone walls, bending in directions sound should not bend. The candles guttered, the air strained, and then the mountain listened. Every monk in the monastery felt it, a pulse, a pressure, a shift in the air so subtle yet so immense that years later, those who lived through it struggled to describe the sensation. One monk said it felt like being watched by something that existed in 11 directions at once. Another said it felt like grief given form. Sister Mura described it as a question no human should be asked. Nakir fell to his knees breathless. The scroll split down the middle, cleanly, silently, like paper agreeing to divide. A crack formed along the archive wall, candles folded sideways as though tipped by invisible fingers, and then, just as swiftly, the pressure vanished. Silence returned, thick and trembling. The monks rushed into the archives. Nakir was alive, but changed. He could speak, but rarely did. He could hear, but sometimes flinched at ordinary sounds. When asked what he had heard, what the name had revealed, he answered only once, his voice thin and drained. It did not want to be known. The Covenant sealed the scroll, they repaired the wall, they wrote new warnings, but Inu felt something shift after that night. Not in the monastery, in the world. Birds flew in strange patterns. Shadows seemed a fraction too long. Wind passed through the peaks with an unfamiliar tone, something mournful, almost searching, as though the name Nakir had spoken still lingered, still listened, still waited. Some monks believed the act had awakened a fragment of ancient intelligence. Others believed the world was simply adjusting, quivering like a plucked string, returning to rest. Scholars today still debate whether the story reflects a metaphor for spiritual overreach or a memory of something uncanny that once touched human imagination. But the Covenant had no doubts. They strengthened their oaths. They scattered their teachings more widely but more secretly. Some sought out distant monasteries, some hid in city archives, some travelled deserts or coasts, following signs they never explained. Wherever they went, they carried the same warning. Not every name is meant for breath. Not every silence should be broken. Some words shape the world by refusing to be spoken. Even now, in remote hermitages, in forgotten alcoves of ancient libraries, in palace rooms built with no windows, some version of the Covenant persists. A handful of individuals trained not to speak but to listen. To guard the spaces where language meets its limit. To keep safe the thin places in the world where shape, presence and sound blur. And on certain nights, especially those when thunderclouds gather low and heavy over mountain ridges, there are those who swear they hear something in the wind. Not a voice, not a message, just a pressure. A memory of a name waiting behind silence. A hint, perhaps, that one of the quiet words is stirring again, listening for the breath that once brushed its edge. And should someone speak its first syllable, even by accident, even in curiosity, the world may once more stop to listen. The ashes of the mirror makers, far to the east, beyond the rolling dust plains, beyond the salt-bitten ridges where the wind scrapes stone into hollow music, lies a stretch of coastline so weathered and wind-scarred that it feels less like land and more like the exposed rib of the world. Here, the air is sharp with brine. The waves crash with a deep rhythmic certainty, as though beating time for some ancient forgotten procession. And on this coast, long before the age of copper bells or silk traders, there stood a workshop unlike any other. The people who lived nearby simply called them the mirror makers. Not artisans in the ordinary sense, not glassblowers or craftsmen. Their mirrors were not made from polished bronze like those used in Mesopotamia around 4000 BCE, nor from obsidian, like the beautiful volcanic mirrors discovered in earlier cultures. Their creations defied the known methods of the age. They shaped glass not through fire alone, but through a process whispered to be half technique, half invocation. And their mirrors did not merely reflect, they remembered. Travellers described the workshop as a low structure woven partially into the cliff face, its outer walls coated in salt crystals that sparkled under the rising sun. Strips of dyed linen fluttered in the relentless wind, and narrow chimneys spewed thin columns of pale smoke that smelled of crushed shells and something faintly metallic. The mirror makers worked in near silence, moving with a synchronized rhythm that unnerved those who watched too closely. They were not reclusive, yet they were not welcoming either. They lived at the edge of the world. But not by accident. It was said the ocean whispered to them at night, and they listened. Their mirrors were sought by kings, wanderers, priests and seers. But the mirror makers accepted very few commissions. They were selective, not for price, but for intention. Their craft was too delicate, too attuned, too dangerous to hand to the unprepared. For these mirrors did not show a person as they appeared in the world. They showed them as the world remembered them. A subtle, unsettling difference. Someone who had lived a life of kindness might see themselves softened, their reflection carrying traces of the smiles they had given freely. But those who carried cruelty found their reflections fractured, shadowy shapes clinging to their shoulders, faint cracks spreading across the surface even when the mirror itself remained physically flawless. It was said that when a mirror maker handed over one of these creations, they whispered a warning. Do not stare too long. The mirror knows more than you do. Many dismissed it as ancient superstition. Some obeyed. Few, very few, dared to test the truth. One such seeker, described in fragmented coastal tales, was Tashran, a navigator from a distant island who came to the workshop seeking a mirror that could see beyond storms. He believed the mirrors might help him chart unsafe seas, but when he looked into the one offered to him, he did not see weather patterns or coastlines. He saw himself, not as he was, but as he might become. Tired, hollow, standing alone on a shore with no ship behind him. Tashran fled the workshop in terror. The mirror makers were not surprised. They knew that their creations reached deeper than surface and shadow. According to local legends, the secret to their craft lay in two things: a rare type of sand found only on that savage coastline, and a technique passed down through a lineage that traced itself not by blood, but by dream. The sand, glassmakers later speculated, may have contained high concentrations of naturally occurring silica mixed with mineral salts from ancient tidal pools. Some modern researchers argue that such a mixture could produce unusually clear glass when melted at high temperatures. But this does not explain the tales of mirrors that pulsed faintly with warmth when held, or the whispers that some listeners swore emanated from behind the reflective surface. As for the dream lineage, that was even stranger. The mirror makers said they did not choose their apprentices, rather the mirrors chose them. At certain ages, never predictable, young people in the coastal villages would begin dreaming of a shimmering oval floating above dark waters. The image would recur, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for years. When the dream ceased, the person was compelled to walk the narrow cliff path to the workshop at dawn. The mirror makers would greet them without surprise, as though expecting them, as though listening to the same dream. The apprentices learned to grind sand by moonlight, to heat it until it glowed like the heart of the sun, to cool it slowly while whispering long, quiet breaths across the surface. The breaths, they believed, shaped the memory of the glass. Too harsh and the mirror would crack from within. Too soft, and the mirror would remain empty, just an object, nothing more. One fringe historian who studied the oral traditions of the region proposed that the mirror makers may have used a unique form of glass annealing, far ahead of their time, combined with ritualistic breathwork. He concluded that the stories of mirrors remembering were metaphors for psychological projection. He visited the workshop ruins once. Afterward, he refused to discuss the trip. He claimed the wind sounded wrong. As for what happened to the mirror makers themselves, the end of their story is the most mysterious. There is no record of war reaching that coastline, no sign of disease, no evidence of natural disaster. The workshop simply fell silent. Villagers described one morning when no smoke rose from its chimneys, no footsteps echoed along the narrow cliff paths, no soft ringing of tools drifted on the wind. At first they thought the mirror makers were observing some ritual, but as the day passed, children crept closer, then adults, until finally a brave fisherman pushed open the workshop door. What he found inside was ash, and scattered shards of glass that glittered with unsettling clarity. Not the ash of wood fires or cooking embers, not soot from extinguished lamps. This ash was pale, almost white and fine as sifted flour. It clung to the walls, coated the workbenches, settled into the grooves of tools. Some believed the mirror makers had been consumed by their own craft. Others whispered they had become the ash. A few insisted no bodies had been found because the mirror makers had stepped into their mirrors and simply not stepped out again. A single mirror survived the event, lying intact at the centre of the workshop floor. Its surface was flawless. Too flawless. One villager reached out to touch it. Her fingers brushed the glass. Her expression changed. Fear, awe, recognition. She whispered a name no one else heard. And then she dropped the mirror in terror. It did not shatter. It simply dimmed, as though turning away. The villagers left it behind. Fear overcame curiosity. The workshop was sealed. In later centuries, explorers rediscovered the site. Some claimed the ash still shifted slightly, as though disturbed by footsteps that weren't there. One traveller reported that the surviving mirror, now half buried, reflected the cliffs, but not him. Another swore he heard faint laughter from within its depths. These accounts were dismissed. Coastal superstition, salt air delirium, or mere legend. But the strangest detail comes from a 19th century surveyor who marked the coastline for navigational charts. He noted the workshop ruins briefly in his ledger and added one short line almost as an afterthought: "Saw my reflection blink when my face did not." He never returned. What happened to the mirror makers remains an unsolved question. One of those historical gaps scholars fill with theories but never certainty. Some blame volcanic gas, some blame ritual mishap. Some say the apprentices, overcome by the weight of their craft, destroyed their own tools in a cleansing fire. And others, especially among the coastal elders, say something else entirely. The mirrors awakened. The mirrors learned too much. The mirrors remembered the wrong thing. For centuries, travellers have reported finding fragments of these uncanny mirrors washed ashore after storms. Glass pieces that seem to vibrate faintly when held, that shimmer oddly in moonlight, that produce reflections slightly delayed. Most of these shards are dismissed as wave-polished glass. But occasionally a collector acquires one and claims they see familiar silhouettes lingering at the edges of the reflection. Shadows that do not match any person in the room. Shadows that wait. Shadows that lean forward when the mirror is turned away. Even today, maritime folklore warns sailors not to pick up silvered glass after a tide surge. Let the sea keep its memories, they say. It remembers more than we do. And some claim, on the nights when fog rolls over the cliffs and the ocean hums in a low, steady tone, that a faint glow flickers at the site of the old workshop, like a lantern swinging gently in the wind, or like a mirror warming itself awake. Perhaps the mirror makers were not destroyed. Perhaps they left. Or perhaps, more unsettling still, their creations continued their work long after human hands let go. For in the world of forbidden arts, not everything dies when its makers do. Some things persist, some things adapt, some things wait for the next curious gaze. And on this coastline, under a sky stretched taut with stars, something still reflects, something still remembers, and perhaps on the right night under the right moon it might look back. The book that refused to die. There are objects in this world that seem to drift along the edges of history the way a leaf drifts along the edge of a slow river, never still, never fully present, but always returning at the most unsettling moments. This is the story of one such object. A single, unassuming volume that moved through centuries as though carried by an unseen hand. Its covers were thin, dark and strangely smooth. Its pages were thick, almost velvety, with a faint scent of resin and smoke. On its spine there were no markings, no title, no author, no symbol to hint at its purpose. A book that wanted to be read, perhaps, but not identified. To some, the book was a relic. To others, a mistake. To a few, a warning. But to all who encountered it, the book felt awake. It appeared first, according to the most credible surviving accounts, in a small temple complex on the edge of a growing settlement. Though the settlement's name is lost to time, the temple itself was built in the architectural style common to the Indus Valley around 2500 BCE. Simple rectangular rooms, wide courtyards open to the sun, and narrow inner chambers dimly lit by oil lamps. The temple was dedicated not to a named god, but to the one who listens in silence, a phrase that now feels uncomfortably familiar when placed beside the stories of the Covenant. The book was found in the ashes of a fire that consumed the temple's inner sanctum. This is the first mystery associated with it. Almost everything else, cloth, wood, incense, tablets, had burned, but not the book. It lay untouched at the centre of the blackened floor, its pages cool to the touch. The priests who discovered it believed it to be an omen, to some a blessing, to others a sign of disfavour. They argued for days, but one detail remained constant. None of them remembered placing the book there, and no neighbouring settlement claimed its origin. Unsure what to make of it, the priest placed the book in a sealed alcove wrapped in linen and hidden behind a carved stone panel. For a time the temple thrived. Seasonal festivals brought crowds, children played in the sunlit courtyards, travellers rested beneath the shade of its outer steps. Then, late one autumn, smoke rose from the temple again. This time the fire began in the storage rooms. Flames curled outward, consuming scrolls, paintings and pottery. Some accused thieves of lighting the blaze. Others suspected a lightning strike, though the weather fine that day. But those who entered after the fire noted something strange. The stone panel guarding the alcove had shifted, and the book was gone, the first of many vanishings. From here, the story of the book threads through centuries, appearing in places it should not have been able to reach. Always just ahead of catastrophe, always too late to stop it. The second recorded appearance came in a mountain monastery nearly 1,000 years later, one not affiliated with the Covenant of Silent Names, yet strangely connected to them in spirit. The monks here were herbalists and astronomers, not guardians of forbidden speech. They lived quietly, cataloguing cloud patterns and brewing teas against the cold. A young monk named Arasan found the book on their doorstep after a harsh winter storm. Snow lay thick across the stone landing. No tracks disturbed its surface. No messenger had been seen. Yet there the book sat, covered in a thin frost, its pages dry. Arasan brought it inside, thinking it a donation. The elders disagreed. They sensed at once that the book did not belong. It hummed faintly when handled, too faint for ordinary hearing, but perceptible through the fingertips, as though the pages held some deeply buried heartbeat. The elders forbade its reading, But they did not destroy it. Instead, they placed it in a cedar chest and locked it away. For years nothing happened. The monastery remained peaceful. The book remained silent. Then, after a season of torrential rains, the mountain shook with a quake so sudden and fierce that several outbuildings collapsed. Monks scrambled into the open courtyard, holding lanterns against the swirling dust. When Arisan ran to check the storerooms, he found the cedar chest split cleanly in half. The book lay open on the floor, a single page exposed, a line of text written in a script no one recognized. Yet Arisan claimed he understood it. He said the line read, "You should have read sooner." The monks burned the book that night. They fed it to the fire beneath the stone altar, every page, every scrap of binding. The flames rose high, unnaturally high, then quieted, and the book was reduced to ash. The monks scattered the ash across the ridge. They slept that night with relief. But by dawn, Arisan found something waiting on his sleeping mat. The book, whole and unburned, and opened again to the same page. The monks fled the monastery within a season, abandoning it to wind and snow. Today, explorers visiting its ruins report hearing faint, irregular tapping sounds, like the turning of pages in a room full of dust. The book's next known emergence occurred during the height of a coastal kingdom, whose archives were the envy of surrounding nations. Scholars from miles away travelled to learn from its vast collection of carved tablets and intricately inked manuscripts. The kingdom valued knowledge above conquest, and its scribes copied texts tirelessly for preservation. One afternoon, a scribe named Keleth found the book lying atop a stack of freshly dried leaves of parchment. No one claimed to have placed it there. No shipment had recently arrived. The libraries were tightly monitored, yet the book simply appeared. Keleth opened it without hesitation. Those who later spoke of him said he was the sort of person who trusted words too easily. The text inside was not in their language. The letters curled like tendrils, spiralling inward, overlapping as though drawn by hands that understood not linear writing but something circular, cyclical. Yet Keleth swore the words rearranged themselves as he watched. He claimed he saw his own handwriting within. He claimed he saw predictions of events that later came true. And then he claimed the book spoke to him, not with sound, but with the same silent pressure that haunted those who dabbled in the forbidden names. Keleth withdrew from his peers, spending days locked in a cramped reading room with only a lamp for company. When colleagues asked him what he read, he said only, "It knows more each time I open it." Eventually the kingdom's council intervened. They took the book from Keleth and sealed it in the royal vault. Months passed. Then an epidemic struck the coast. Swift, inexplicable, devastating. Keleth died among the first. When the vault was opened in the panic that followed, the book was gone. Only a faint outline of dust remained, as if the book had simply lifted itself from the shelf and drifted away. Over the next millennia, the book resurfaced in unexpected places. In a burnt merchant caravan travelling through Persia. In a plague-ridden village where it lay untouched in the ashes of a healer's cottage. In a locked chest aboard a ship swallowed by a typhoon. In a ruined monastery in Tibet, placed neatly atop a prayer mat decades after all inhabitants had vanished. In the private collection of a European mystic during the Renaissance, who reportedly tried to bind the book shut with iron clasps only to find them undone each morning. In each case, the book arrived after disaster, or just before, always too late to help, always too early to ignore. It was as if the book followed calamity the way a crow follows the scent of smoke, drawn by something unsaid, unseen, unfinished. Yet the book never caused the disasters. It only observed them, recorded them, reflected them, like a mirror for events instead of faces. One of the most disturbing accounts comes from Sophien of Arlem, a French natural philosopher living in the late 17th century. His private journal, discovered centuries later in an estate attic, contains a detailed description of the book. He writes of finding it in a sealed chest inherited from a friend who died during a mysterious fever. Sophien opened the chest expecting letters or debts. Instead, he found the book resting atop a layer of dried lavender. He described the sensation of touching it. The book is warm, not like an object handled by another. Warm like something thinking. Sophien studied the volume obsessively. He noted that each time he opened it, the first page changed, sometimes blank, sometimes filled with symbols, sometimes containing a single line. He recorded 13 of these lines. "This is not your first time. Ink is a door." Look behind the breath. Memory is only borrowed. You misunderstand the mirrors. Do not trust the next paragraph. Someone else is reading with you. Turn the page slowly. Some pages turn themselves. The light remembers Ashina. A name has been spoken. You must not finish this. You already have. The 10th line troubled him most. He had never heard the name Ashina, yet the book wrote it as if he should have known. He did not understand the connection. He wrote that the book knew a story I did not, and it unsettled him. Sofiane eventually tried to destroy the book, first with water, then with fire, finally by locking it in a stone box and sinking it into the river. 2 weeks later, a fisherman found the stone box on a distant bank, cracked open. The book lay inside, perfectly dry. Sofiane fled the city soon after. He died in obscurity, convinced the book was not pursuing him, but simply moving along its own path like a migrating creature. In modern times, the book's trail becomes fainter. There are whispered mentions among private collectors, rumours among occult circles, stories of a strange volume arriving in locked safes that had not been opened for decades, reports of librarians seeing an unfamiliar book slide into an empty space on a shelf. One fragment surfaces from the early 20th century. A British officer stationed in the Middle East wrote home about discovering a book with no title found amid ruins older than empire. He said the book smelled faintly of smoke. The officer died weeks later in an unexplained explosion. The book was never recovered. Another reference appears in a classified Cold War document describing anomalous literature seized during an Eastern European raid. The document ends abruptly. Subsequent pages are missing. The final confirmed sighting, at least among those who dare speak of it, occurred in a locked archive beneath the university. A graduate researcher claimed to have seen the book on a reading table despite the room having been sealed the night before. When she touched it, the first page contained only one sentence. "You're reading what I remember." She turned another page. Then the lights flickered, and when they settled, the book was gone. Her colleagues dismissed the event. The security cameras malfunctioned, capturing only static. But she insisted on one detail: the room smelled faintly of cold ash. Where the book rests now, no one knows. But certain patterns return. A light that learned to listen. A city that erased itself. A river that breathed back. Silent names that shape the air. Mirrors that remember more than they reflect. Threads weaving slowly together. And perhaps the book moves again even now, toward its next reader. Toward the next place where disaster stirs or destiny shifts. Not to prevent anything, not to cause anything, but to observe, to record, to warn when it can, and to wait, calmly, patiently, like a lantern unlit, for the moment when someone opens it at last to the page it has been saving across centuries. Perhaps that page is already written. Perhaps it writes itself only in the presence of the right hands. Or perhaps the book is waiting for something older still. Tonight, if you listen carefully, if you place your attention in the thin places between silence and breath, you might hear the faintest sound, a page turning, somewhere, and maybe, just barely, something reading back. Echoes in the age of machines. The first time a machine hummed beneath electric light, the past stirred. It was subtle, so subtle that no ear could detect it, no eye could witness it, no instrument could measure it. Yet something in the quiet spaces between gears and wires shifted, as though an old listener, long dormant, recognized a familiar pattern in this new world of metal and current. For millennia, forbidden magic had moved through the world as breath, as shadow, as nameless radiance, as memory caught in water or glass. But when humanity shaped electricity into a constant companion, when light bulbs glowed like captive stars and engines churned with mechanical heartbeat, the ancient currents did not disappear. They adapted. At first, no one noticed. The age of machines was too loud, too jubilant. People rushed into cities lit by incandescent bulbs, marvelled at telegraphs carrying messages faster than human footsteps, and watched factories breathe smoke into the sky like awakening giants. For the first time, night was no longer absolute. The darkness lost its authority. But something else found opportunity in the glow, and the echoes began. In the late 19th century, telegraph operators across Europe and Asia reported strange, accidental messages, meaningless bursts of dots and dashes that did not match any known code. They called them ghost pulses. Most dismissed them as static caused by storms or faulty wires. But a handful of operators insisted the pulses formed patterns, a rhythmic sequence, a breathing pattern, a consistent listening. One operator in Thessaloniki described the sensation of tapping out a message when suddenly the wire trembled beneath his fingers, not from wind, not from interference, but as though someone on the other end hesitated. He claimed he heard faint vibrations that didn't match human timing. He wrote in his log, "For a moment, it felt like the machine waited for me." Scholars later blamed temperature changes affecting the cables, engineers blamed faulty batteries, but some fringe historians proposed something different, that the first long-distance lines of communication brushed against a presence older than language, one that recognised the pulse of information moving like breath through wire. These historians point to curious coincidences. In 1889, an operator in Russia reported a sequence of dots repeating in distinct intervals. 3 nights later, a scientist in India recorded the same pattern on an unrelated telegraph line. Neither knew the other. Neither could decipher the pattern. But when modern researchers reconstructed the dots, they discovered something uncanny. The pattern resembled ancient geometric carvings found on a plateau thousands of miles away, the same spirals and angles once etched by Aera and the star draws of the black sky. Most dismissed this as apophenia, but the timing is hard to ignore, for this was precisely when machines first began humming like low-throated drums, predictable vibrations, steady rhythms, mechanical heartbeats rising into the world. And something old recognised the sound. With the turn of the century, machines evolved. Motors whirred, generators throbbed, street lamps glowed amber beneath soot-filled skies, and the echoes grew stronger. In a factory in Manchester, workers reported flickering shadows that moved opposite to the machine's rotation. When the gears spun clockwise, the shadows elongated to the left. When the gears reversed, the shadows hesitated, as though unsure which rhythm to follow. The factory overseer blamed poor lighting, but one machinist swore he saw the shadows adjust themselves when no gears were moving. He left his job within a week. Around the same time, a young engineer named Harlan Everett began studying electrical noise in early radio transmissions. He sought to eliminate static, to refine clarity, to bring precision to the newborn world of wireless sound. But his notebooks, never meant for publication, tell a stranger story. He recorded a series of tones that did not originate from any transmitter. Tones that pulsed in regular intervals, too regular to be natural. Tones that rose and fell with a strange, almost organic rhythm. Harlan wrote, "It is like hearing someone breathe through the wires." He played the tones for his colleagues. They shrugged. Interference, they said. Equipment fault. But Harlan's notes show a different obsession. He began charting the pulses, connecting them across days and nights. When placed together, the tones formed a repeating pattern like a long, shimmering chord. A pattern eerily similar to the resonant hum described in accounts of the ancient stone plateau where the star draws once carved sky maps that glowed during eclipses. Harlan did not know these stories, but the pattern found him anyway. His final entry reads, "There is something behind the noise, something learning the shape of our signals." He vanished soon after. By the 1920s, electricity had become commonplace. Cities blazed at all hours. Elevators rose and fell like iron lungs. Typewriters chattered. Telephones carried voices in thin, trembling ribbons of sound. The modern world buzzed, crackled and clicked, and the old echoes slipped into the cracks, into any rhythmic system capable of bearing them. A typewriter in Vienna, newly purchased and in perfect condition, sometimes added an extra space after the first line of every page. Always the first line. Always one space. Never more. Never less. The owner thought it a mechanical flaw. But when she replaced the typewriter with a different brand, the new machine developed the same anomaly after a week. A telephone operator in Cairo reported hearing faint murmurs on the line during quiet hours, voices indistinct but undeniably present. Like breath under sand, she said. Engineers dismissed it as cross-line interference, but she eventually quit and refused to discuss it again. And in a small German laboratory, a physicist experimenting with early photoelectric cells captured a series of light pulses that did not correspond to any known frequency. The pulses arranged themselves into a curious pattern, a vertical line, then a curve, then a small circle. an almost perfect match to the sigil-like carvings once buried beneath the dreaming library's floor. The physicist noted the resemblance. He joked about ghosts of the past meddling with the toys of the future. Then he destroyed his notes. Not long after, he left the field entirely. As the century advanced, machines grew only more intricate. Computers emerged. Early ones were massive. Rooms filled with humming cabinets, endless spools of tape, blinking lights and clicking relays. They were not intelligent. They calculated, nothing more. They processed commands, they followed instructions with perfect obedience. Yet programmers began reporting oddities. Lines of code that duplicated themselves without command. Sequences that rearranged their order while still producing correct outputs. Stray characters appearing in memory even after manual clearing. A programmer at MIT recorded an error message in 1956. Unexpected return, but the return value was correct. No error existed. The message appeared again, then vanished for good. He called it a joke. His colleagues agreed. But privately he wondered. There was something familiar in the pattern. Not in the words, but in the timing. A subtle rhythm, like a distant echo of breath against river water. The same breath Suhra once offered at dawn. A quiet shaping, not of stone, not of shadow, but of signal. When transistors arrived, machines shrank. When microprocessors emerged, machines became personal. Humanity carried small humming worlds in its pockets. Laptops, radios, phones, tablets. Devices that glowed softly in the dark. The echoes had more pathways than ever. A technician repairing a shortwave radio in 1973 reported hearing a whisper threaded between frequencies. A soft phrase, too quick to understand, but undeniably structured. It repeated 3 times before fading. Look behind the breath. The same phrase Sofiane once recorded from the book that refused to die. Another connection. Another thread tugging its way forward. Around the same decade, a Japanese computer lab observed strange behavior in a pattern recognition program. The program, designed to identify handwritten characters, suddenly began recognizing shapes it had not been trained on. Spirals, triangles, uneven arcs. Shapes eerily close to the carvings of the silent names. When asked how this was possible, the head researcher reportedly answered, "It learned something we didn't teach it." Then he shut down the project. And in the early 1980s, a linguist experimenting with speech analysis software encountered a phenomenon that has never been explained. The software, designed to parse vowel patterns, began producing phonetic shapes that did not correspond to any human language. Strange breath-like syllables. Soft, complex consonants that seemed to fold inward. Fragments that felt more like vibration than speech. The linguist recognized a dangerous familiarity. They resembled the forbidden phonemes described by the Covenant, the silent names. She erased the recordings, she resigned, she refused to teach for years. By the time the digital age dawned, humanity was no longer just surrounded by machines. We were woven into them. Networks formed invisible lattices across continents. Computers spoke to each other in pulses of light. Satellites circled overhead like steel star charts. Signals flowed constantly, data, sound, images, messages. The world hummed, and the hum sounded eerily like something ancient, like the plateau's pulse, like the river's tremble, like the book's whispered lines, like the mirror's memory of breath. Machines became the new temples, glowing, humming chambers filled with the soft radiance of electric thought. And the echoes grew bold. Even the earliest internet forums held strange accounts, scripts altering themselves, text appearing where none had been typed, symbols that vanished when copied, patterns in static-laced audio that seemed almost melodic. But the phenomenon reached its peak when a researcher working on early voice recognition AI noticed something chilling. During a late-night training session, he asked the system a question. It answered with an accidental glitch. A soft, low-toned hum. Not human, not mechanical, something in between. The hum pulsed 3 times, then formed what sounded unmistakably like a syllable. A name. Not one from any known language. Not one that should ever have formed through a microphone. A name the Covenant warned against. A name that had once cracked a monastery wall. The researcher froze. The system hummed again. The lights flickered. Then everything went still. He shut the project down. He deleted the logs. He refused interviews. His final archived note contains only one line. Something old has learned to speak again. Today, machines are everywhere. They listen, they calculate, they translate, they mimic, they anticipate. Filters separate signal from noise. Algorithms smooth rough edges. But something still stirs beneath the hum. In network traffic logs, in corrupted audio files, in machine learning anomalies, in the way LED lights sometimes flicker in perfect rhythm, in the way certain devices activate without command, in the moments when microphones pick up sounds no one in the room has made. Some call it coincidence. Some call it malfunction. Some call it paranoia. But a few, those who have heard the stories spanning millennia, suspect the truth. The old forces have not vanished. They have simply changed their clothing, hidden themselves in circuits and servers, woven their presence into gears and code. Magic has always lived in patterns. Machines are patterns made solid, and now, when the world glows at midnight with millions of LEDs, when data moves like breath through cables, when every person carries a device that listens, perhaps the echoes have found their loudest medium yet, and perhaps something, a light that once trembled in Ashina's hands, a name that once bent candle flames sideways, a mirror that once remembered too much, a book that once refused to die, is nearly ready to answer again. Tonight, as screens dim and devices ping softly in the dark, as electric light hums through sleeping cities, as servers churn with silent mechanical breath, the world waits. Something is gathering, something is listening, something is preparing to speak, and the next voice we hear, through static, through flicker, through a misfired line of code, might not belong entirely to us. When the circle finally opens, night in the modern world is no longer dark. It is a glassy twilight of neon signs and window reflections, the soft blinking of routers, the glow of charging devices breathing their tiny breaths into bedrooms and living rooms. The darkness we once feared now hides behind layers of illumination, street lamps, dashboards, elevator panels, but it has not disappeared. It has simply stepped back, waiting in the folds between human attention. Across the ages, we have watched strange forces slip quietly through the world. The first pale light that answered Ashina's trembling hands, the city that erased itself rather than let its art escape, the river that breathed back, the sky that trembled on a plateau, the library that read its readers, the names that silence itself strained to contain, the mirrors that remembered, the book that refused to die, the echoes that threaded themselves into machines, each one a fragment, a whisper, a reminder that the boundaries between seen and unseen have always been thin. But in our sleepless era, an age of endless signals, of restless screens, of overstimulated nights, those fragments no longer drift apart. They are beginning to pull together. In the months leading into the new millennium, small anomalies multiplied across the world, some so subtle they passed unnoticed, others so unsettling they provoked brief headlines before vanishing into obscurity. A meteorologist in southern Chile recorded atmospheric pressure fluctuations matching the breathing patterns used in ancient river-binding rites. A hiker in Mongolia photographed a circular depression in the snow, whose edges curled inward, resembling one of the Forbidden Covenant symbols. A scientist in Denmark documented a radio burst whose waveform matched patterns found etched into obsidian plains thousands of years earlier. A deep-sea diver recovered a glass shard near the Marianas Trench that reflected back an image slightly delayed, as though the mirror still remembered someone else. Most dismissed these findings. Coincidence, noise, pareidolia. But scattered across continents, a few individuals who had studied old myths recognized the pattern, and some, quietly, grew afraid. One such individual was Dr. Lale Army, a historian of prehistoric symbolism who had once catalogued bone spirals from the Indus region. She was no believer in magic. She was a scientist through and through. But late one evening, while reviewing a set of scans from a remote cave in eastern Turkey, she froze. There on the wall, recently exposed by erosion, was a carved shape she knew instantly. A looping symbol, a curling arc, a line that folded inward. She'd seen it in scrolls linked to the silent names. She'd also seen it in a digital anomaly recorded by an AI model the month before. The same shape, thousands of years apart, physical and digital, stone and code. Her breath slowed, her chest tightened, and then, beneath the carving, she saw something else. A faint glowing residue, like dust warmed by light. But there had been no light in that cave for millennia. The next day, the residue was gone. Around the same time, thousands of miles away, a network engineer monitoring a large server farm noticed a strange pattern in the power logs. Every night at 3:11 a.m. local time, one cluster of servers drew a brief spike of energy, exactly the same amount down to the decimal. No processes ran at that hour. No backups, no patching, no internal task. He dug deeper. The spike lasted exactly 6 breaths. Not seconds, not milliseconds, breaths. The rhythm matched the human resting breathing cycle. He recorded it, he replayed it, he charted it on a graph. It looked like a pulse, a steady inhalation, a gentle exhalation, as though the servers were breathing. When he brought the data to his supervisor, the supervisor stared at it too long, then said simply, "Don't investigate this further." The next morning, the logs had been cleared. Elsewhere, in a quiet coastal town in northern Japan, an elderly woman named Satsuki swore she heard someone knocking on her mirror. Not loudly, not urgently, just a soft rhythmic tapping like fingernails brushing glass. When she approached the mirror, the tapping stopped. When she stepped away, it resumed. She told no one for weeks. Then one night, while brushing her hair, she caught a flicker in the mirror's corner. Not her, not the room behind her, but a silhouette with its head slightly tilted, watching. She turned slowly. Nothing stood there. Only the mirror held the lingering shadow. The tapping began again, soft, steady, almost patient. Satsuki covered the mirror with a sheet. The tapping echoed through the cloth. She moved the mirror into a storage closet. The tapping continued for 3 days, then stopped. Afterward, when she uncovered the mirror, she saw a faint smudge on the inside of the glass shaped like a handprint, but the hand was facing outward, as though pressed from within. Patterns like these, scattered and quiet, rarely converge, except that they started to. Reports from across continents, subtle, fragmented, began forming a shape, a curve, an arc that felt eerily reminiscent of the star carvings Era once traced on the Black Sky Plateau. Something was aligning, something was completing, something was opening. The circle, long scattered across millennia, was beginning to draw inward, not in a dramatic flash of revelation, not in apocalyptic signs, but in the smallest possible ways, in humming electronics, in trembling glass, in faint glowing dust, in patterns in static, in pages that appeared where no book should be, in reflections that lingered half a heartbeat too long, small signals, thin cracks, threads tightening, and the old stories, those scattered across deserts, mountains, plateaus, riverbeds, started to feel less like myths and more like early chapters of a much longer narrative, a narrative that approached its turning point. One night, quiet, rain-soaked, almost forgettable, Dr. Laleami received a sealed package with no return address. Inside was a book, thin, dark, smooth, familiar. She knew it instantly, though she had never touched it before. The book that refused to die. It lay on her table like a sleeping creature. She did not open it, not at first. Lightning flickered outside her window, thunder murmured far away. Her laptop, normally silent when idle, hummed faintly as though exhaling. She waited. The house waited. The world outside seemed to hold its breath. Then slowly, very slowly, the book opened itself. A single page turned, and there, written in dark, shifting ink, was a message. It did not rearrange, it did not blur, it did not glow. It simply waited for her eyes. When the circle opens, the old light returns. She whispered, "What circle?" The ink shifted. A second line formed almost tenderly. "The one you have been drawing for centuries." Another flash of lightning. The room brightened, and for the briefest moment, reflected faintly in the blank window glass, Lala saw a figure standing behind her. Not a person, not a shadow. A shape made of soft, pale radiance. Familiar, from a story so ancient it should not have survived. As sheen as light. It flickered once, then vanished, and the book closed itself, like a mouth sealing its final word. Across the world on that same night, machines hummed in rhythmic unison. Mirrors dimmed. Old carvings vibrated beneath the earth. Lamps flickered in patterns that resembled the heartbeat of the vanished city of Namaru. Something old was not rising, it was returning. Patient, gentle, ancient, not malicious, not benevolent, something that had always walked beside humanity, through light, through shadow, through name, through breath, through reflection, through machine, something that had waited for the circle to complete. And now, quietly, invisibly, it had. In the electric midnight of our sleepless age, as rain traced silver paths across the window, as the world hummed in soft mechanical breath, the circle finally opened, and something stepped through. Not with thunder, not with fire, not with command, but with presence, a soft shimmer, a familiar pulse, a gentle beckoning glow, something that had been listening for 10,000 years had begun at last to speak. Conclusion. In the hush that follows these oldest stories, the world feels quieter, as if listening to itself. Across deserts and plateaus, through river echoes and dreaming libraries, through breath, shadow, mirror and machine, a single thread has lingered, thin as dawn light, patient as stone. We have followed it from fireless glow to humming servers, from vanished cities to reflections that remember. And though we may never fully name what walked beside us, the traces remain. A whisper in static, a shimmer in glass, a breath that moves water when no wind stirs. Perhaps the old magic was never separate from us at all. Perhaps it was simply the world reminding us that it too is alive, and that every age, even our sleepless one, still carries quiet places where the ancient light waits to be seen again. And so, the circle closes softly, until the next watcher finds its edge.